Hi everybody, this is lecture 3, and we're going to be talking about dogs cross-culturally in this unit. In a lot of ways, I think we're sort of finally getting to the real heart of the cultural anthropology in this course. The first two lectures were really more about sort of context and background and some of the other subfields takes on dogs. And now you're reading some ethnographic case studies that talk about how dogs are treated and how people and dogs interact in several different cultural contexts. And that's really the heart of what cultural anthropologists do. And what you're reading is what ethnography looks like, right? The product of ethnographic field research. So there's a lot going on there. And what I'm hoping to do in this lecture is to talk a little bit more about cultural anthropology, and particularly the concept of culture, and then look at those three case studies and see what sort of bigger themes they suggest about dogs and humans and their relationships. Okay, so let's start with sort of the big concepts. As I said, we're really now finally, I think, getting into the heart of looking at cultural anthropology and how cultural anthropologists study things, in this case, dogs and their relationships with people. So there's some broader questions that we probably want to return to or entertain a bit before we dig into these specific cases. The first is, if we're looking at dogs in cultural context, we need to think a little bit more carefully about what culture is in the first place. And culture is not necessarily an easy concept, even as it is central to cultural anthropology. I mean, it's even in the name, right? It's one that even cultural anthropologists have debated about and wrestled with for more than a century. For the purposes of where we're at right now in the course, how I'm going to define culture is as everything that people do, feel, think, and say in the context of a particular social world. All right? There's a few things to note about that definition. The first is that it's both observable actions and sort of concepts and ideas and ideologies, things that are in people's minds and inform how they think about the world. So it's not always stuff that's easy to access at first glance. And the second is that it's very specific to what I'm calling here a particular social world. That means that culture, the way the cultural anthropologists are going to study culture is going to be limited to thinking about the details of how people do stuff in one place at a particular moment in time. All right. So again, when we get into the case studies, you'll see that. So anthropologists are not talking about sort of human culture in general, but are really talking about how culture manifests in a particular place at a particular time. Okay. Now, how do we learn about that? I already mentioned in a previous lecture that the ways that cultural anthropologists collect information is through what we call ethnographic field work, which means spending a lot of time with people in the place where they live and doing their sort of day-to-day things that they do. So anthropologists really are interested in how people live their lives in the moment, from day to day, sort of everyday practices, right? As well as specialized things that happen along the way. But it's really more about trying to learn what it's like to inhabit a particular cultural world, right? So in that process of ethnographic field research, obviously, cultural anthropologists are going to use certain kinds of methodological tools, right? Interviews are an important one, which simply means having conversations with people through which you ask them to tell you about stuff, relate stories, etc., right? So conversation is certainly one. So there's definitely a sort of verbal part of how anthropologists collect their information. There's also very much an observational part. But one of the sort of cornerstones of ethnographic field research is a practice called participant observation, which means basically watching what people do, but not only watching it, but also sort of engaging in it yourself, trying your hand at what the people around you are doing, and learning not only by what you see them doing, but also by the experience of trying to do it yourself, right? So a lot of what's in these case studies that you're reading is the result of these particular anthropologists going to a particular place, spending time with the people who live there, and engaging in things like ongoing and extended conversations, watching what people around you are doing, doing the stuff that people around you are doing, right? That participant observation part. And through all of those different kinds of activities, collecting a lot of information about, again, what it's like to live in that space. To some extent, what that means is that the work that anthropologists do is holistic, meaning it looks at the phenomenon of living in a particular place from multiple angles in a sort of 360-degree way, right? Now, that said, a particular anthropologist is not going to try to study everything. It would be simply overwhelming. So anthropologists do also sort of specialize or focus on one aspect or one component of what they're seeing in the day-to-day lives of the folks with whom they're doing this research, right? But that said, there still is this sense of wanting to recognize that many of the things you encounter are interconnected in the everyday world, that you don't, do politics on Wednesday and art on Thursday and economics on Friday, that in practice, the different elements of a cultural world are integrated. So anthropologists sort of diving into one of those cultural worlds often learn about all kinds of things, even as they end up focusing on particular elements and writing about those elements in detail, okay? Now, what I've had you do is read 3 quite different case studies, right, about different places, they're all about dogs, right? That's the through line, that's the connecting theme, but in other ways they're quite different. So how do we deal with that, right? Like if we're interested in culture and we're interested in the specifics of culture, how do we then think sort of comparatively? And a lot of this is understanding some of the big concepts that underline what I'm calling the worldview of a particular cultural world, right? So one of the things that cultural anthropologists find when we start sort of, again, spending a lot of time in a place is not just a sort of laundry list of, people do this, people do that, people do the other, but some sort of big framing concepts that inform all the other small stuff, right? So one of the things I want you to look for, and that we'll talk about in a second here, is what are those sort of big concepts that are part of the worldview in these 3 quite different cultural spaces, right? When I talk about big concepts, I'm talking about things like personhood, meaning what does it mean to the folks in that place at that moment in time? What does it mean to be a person, right? What constitutes a person? Materiality, meaning what is the significance or lack of significance of the objects around us? And how do we interact with them? And what is or isn't meaningful about those interactions? Relationships, which could be relationships to objects, but also relationships to other beings, right? Whether other humans, living humans who are right before us, relationships with humans who have passed on, right? In many societies, there's ongoing relationships with those who have departed, right? Relationships with dogs, which is what we're going to talk about, and relationships with all kinds of other things, right? And time, right? How do people imagine the passage of time, whether they, keep a detailed written history of their place or not, right? How do people sort of engage with past, present, and future and conceptualize that, right? So those are just some examples of sort of some of those big ideas or big concepts that anthropologists are really interested in sort of trying to understand as we look cross-culturally, right? Remember from our first lecture that cultural anthropologists start from the premise that we're all part of the same human species, right? That we're all connected. We all share a common humanity. And there are lots of sort of differences among us. So looking at these big concepts and both the ways they overlap and the ways that they diverge is a part of that project of recognizing both our shared humanity and all the things we have in common and all the fascinating ways in which we are variable, right, as a human species. Okay. So all of that said, as I mentioned, the way I've sort of chosen to introduce you to what cultural anthropologists do and to the sort of variability in how dogs are imagined cross-culturally is to have you read 3 pieces by anthropologists that talk in detail about dog-human relationships in a particular cultural context. So you read the Cohn article, which is about dogs among the Runa people in the Amazon, right, in South America. You read the Lemon piece, which is about dogs in Moscow riding the subway. And you read the Brandis piece, which is about dogs being, and other pets, being memorialized in pet cemeteries in the U.S., right? So again, really different settings for our overarching sort of question about what's the relationship between people and dogs. So I hope just the variability is interesting. And, you know, again, we don't need to make it all add up so that, like, we have, like, one answer for what dogs and humans mean to each other across space and time. That's not really the point. But I think it is productive and certainly anthropological to think about places of intersection where there's commonalities and places of divergence where we see really radically different conceptualizations of what a dog is or what a dog-human relationship is about. Okay? One point about sort of holism, to sort of return to this idea that anthropologists are particularly interested in connecting the different pieces of everyday life and thinking about any cultural phenomenon sort of from multiple perspectives, is one of the things that I hope is sort of revealed to you through reading these 3 case studies is that we're sort of using dogs as a lens, right? So again, we're interested in the specifics of dogs in cultural context. But I think what also becomes immediately clear is that what these articles are about is not just about dogs, right? So that sort of holistic approach of anthropologists allows us to connect what we learn about dogs to a bunch of other stuff, right? So, for example, some of the themes that I think cut across all 3 of these pieces that you read are the relationship between what I'll call personhood and animalhood, right? Like, what does it mean to be a human, and what does it mean to be a dog? And how do people think about and practice either the gap, right, the distance between what it means to be a human, what it means to be a dog, and or the closeness or even the overlap, right? So those are, again, are people sort of thinking through those big concepts. What does it mean to be me? What does it mean for my dog to be my dog? And how do our selves relate to one another, right? A second theme is sort of a more sort of political historical theme, which is about the state, meaning, you know, in the context of the political units in which we basically all live as contemporary human beings on planet Earth. What is the relationship between the state and the political history of the state and the landscape that we find ourselves in, right? And that landscape being inhabited by both people and dogs, right? So we'll talk about that in a second too. Communication is another key theme that comes out in these 3 articles, both the challenges of communications and what communications actually sound like, right? Particularly when we're talking about communication across difference, or even across the significant difference of species lines, right? And then finally, another theme that I think comes up in a couple of places here is ideas about family and relatedness, maybe more generally, and how, again, our relationships to both other people and animals that are non-human, including dogs, informs and sometimes shifts our ideas of what a family is or what kin relationships are. So those are, you know, again, I could come up with more items for this list, but those are 4 of what I think are the key themes that permeate these 3 articles that you read, and that I think are a really nice starting place for thinking about the cultural anthropology of dog-human relationships. So let's then sort of dig into the details of what these particular case studies say. So the first piece that you read is by Cohn, and as you read, he has done extended field work in the Amazon region with the Runa people. And again, he has a lot to say about a lot of subjects, but in this particular article that you read, he's really talking about the relationship between Runa people and their dogs, and also what that tells us about some of these broader themes. One of Cohn's theoretical contributions is this idea of an anthropology of life. So he's one of the scholars you may recall whose his work is mentioned in the pieces you read in week 1, right? Those sort of theoretical frameworks for multi-species ethnography. He is someone who has encouraged expanding ethnography beyond the human, meaning understanding that people in the various places that they live interact with more than just other people, right? We have dogs. In this case, these folks are hunters, etc., right? We have other kinds of animals in our lives. So it's going to be important then for anthropologists through the mechanism of ethnography to try to capture that complete breadth of what it means to be human, including the ways that we interact with non-humans. So Cohn is a proponent of that. And this piece is, I think, an example of him doing that sort of anthropology of life or ethnography beyond the human. Okay. So what I have on the left side of the screen or left side of the slide is sort of some of the more general points he makes in conceptualizing sort of Runa attitudes toward the relationship between humans and other kinds of species or other kinds of beings. And what I have on the right is specifically about dogs, right? So I thought that was a way to sort of organize our thinking. Cohn is a really interesting anthropologist, but I understand, as you guys are reading this, that the writing is fairly dense. So I'm hoping to sort of parse this for you to help you along as you work on understanding what he's trying to argue. So Cohn starts by sort of pointing out that this particular group of people, right, called the Runa, people he's done extended field research with, have relationships with other kinds of life forms in the forest where they live. That includes dogs, but includes lots of other kinds of animals, right? These are rural people. They engage in activities like hunting. So they have a sort of relationship to the natural world around them that includes, again, all kinds of animals. So he's starting first from that sort of more general idea of how do Runa people sort of think about and engage with the animals around them before getting to the specifics of dogs as one kind of non-human that they interact with. And what he learned is that Runa people understand that other animals, not just themselves, other animals also have selves, meaning they have a point of view on the world. They have their own motivations and intentions, right? So in other words, animals, non-human animals, are not completely different than us, right? They have sort of their own thing going on, their own lives, their own sort of stuff they're up to, their own sense of selfhood, meaning their own sort of perspective on the world. And recognizing that is important for how Runa people conceptualize their relationships with those non-human animals. Cohn, his shorthand for this is a trans-species ecology of selves, right? So in other words, what he's trying to say is that Runa people understand themselves to be one part of a sort of network of other beings, right, that are not human, who each have their sort of own lives and motivations and perspectives and viewpoints going on, right? And that it's important for them, the Runa people, to know about and engage with those others in the forest where they live, all right? So the fact that there's this sense of sort of parallel selfhood, right, across all species, meaning other animals are not some sort of unaware sort of object, right? That they are more similar to humans than different, right? They live in somewhat different realms, but they have sort of a parallel sense of self and sense of direction in the world, if you will, right? So the way, again, Cohn is reporting on sort of the Runa worldview here, right? So he says, Runa understand themselves to be parallel in a lot of ways with other animals, right? In that sense of having a self. being a conscious, motivated, individual entity in the world with your own goals and ideas and opinions on things, basically. But he says it doesn't mean that Runa think that humans and animals are exactly the same, right? And indeed, they think of humans and other kinds of non-human animals as living in kind of different, slightly different worlds, right? He gives the example of vultures, right? If you remember this anecdote, it's that vultures, you know, that vultures sort of eat carcasses that have been, killed by another animal and left to rot, basically, right? So, stinky, rotten meat. And he says, humans smell that gross meat and it stinks. It doesn't smell good. He says for the vultures, the smell of that rotten meat is like a, delicious pot of stew on the stove, right? So again, the difference is in this sort of slightly different perceptual world. It doesn't mean that humans and vultures or humans and dogs are completely different kinds of beings. So if indeed then all different kinds of animals, human and non-human, have the same sort of subjectivity, right? The same sort of motivated personal agenda and perspective on the world, then, he says, the Runa understand that communication across species is possible, right? And in fact, is important. But it's difficult and it can be dangerous. The Runa have told him that the danger comes from the fact that to truly inhabit the subjectivity of another, to see something from somebody else's point of view, to some extent you need to inhabit who and what they are. So you need to kind of become them, right? To a certain extent. And that blurring of the line between human and non-human animal carries some risk, right? So it's possible, and it's actually a good, important thing to do, but you need to mitigate those risks in terms of how you do it, right? So that is really what this article is about. It's about how these folks, this particular group of people, the Runa people in the Amazon, sort of cross that boundary to communicate with their dogs in a way that yields information for both sides, but runs some risk of blurring the lines between the existence of humans and the existence of dogs, and therefore requires certain kinds of practices. And we'll talk about that in a sec, right? But before I leave the left side of the slide, I'll say that, one of the key points that Kohn makes is that the reason it is crucial for this particular group of people to know other kinds of animals, right, and to be able to access the intentions, the motivations of other kinds of animals, is because they live in a forest where they do things like hunt, and where they also need to protect themselves from predatory animals, right? So that sort of being able to tap into the consciousness of other animals to some extent, right, even partially, is actually really important. If you can't do that, you lose your ability to hunt, for example. If you can't do that, you lose your ability to stay one step ahead of predatory animals that can kill you. So again, this becomes, part of how everyday life is lived for people who depend on relationships with animals for their everyday life. Okay, so sort of moving on to the right side of the slide then, dogs are just one category of non-human animal that the Runa engage with. As you learned, these are not sort of pampered pets. So when you learn that the Runa keep dogs, as I'm sure you realized when you were reading, it's not sort of what many people in Chicago would think of when they think about how they engage with their dogs, right? These are dogs who live mostly separate lives from their quote-unquote owners or their keepers, and who often have to, for example, feed themselves, right? Have to go out and hunt down animals to eat. So it's not quite the same as what we imagine as a U.S. sort of pet relationship is like. But the fact of the matter is that dogs and humans' lives are quite closely connected, even as it's not, again, a Western notion of keeping a pet. And part of that connection is that humans are able to know dogs' motivations and to understand their inner lives, particularly through interpreting their dreams. So dogs are understood to dream, right? And I'm sure if you have a dog, you've seen a dog doing what looks like dreaming, right? Or like, running their paws and maybe even barking in their sleep. And so what Cohn reports is that Runa actually interpret the dreams of their dogs, and that is part of how they have sort of a window on the perspective of their dogs, right? It's important because, again, the Runa's lives are interconnected with their dogs, and they need their dogs to engage with them in relevant ways. So indeed, as he explains, the Runa sort of advise their dogs on how to behave, on how to live with humans, to not bark too much or to not bark at humans, but to also not be lazy, to do sort of to help with the hunt in the appropriate ways, etc. Right? So the local version of sort of domesticating dogs has some very specific parameters. And one of the parameters is to actually communicate directly with the dogs, to speak to the dogs. That's not easy, right? Even Runa perspectives on communicating with their dogs are that you need to use very certain kinds of mechanisms to do so. One is to actually give the dog hallucinogens, right? So the slide or the picture that I put in the bottom right of this slide, which is directly from this article, is people administering a hallucinogenic substance to a dog, right? So again, these are not pampered pets. This is not the same kind of relationship to dogs that we might expect or find in the United States. But it's only in those circumstances where something like a hallucinogenic substance is used where that channel of communication can be opened, right? And that boundary between humanness and dog can be breached to some extent. And it's in those moments that people can sort of instruct their dogs and learn what their dogs' perspectives are to a certain extent, right? Part of what Cohn, sort of the context in which Cohn talks about this communication between dogs and humans is about hierarchy, right? And the need for Runa to both open a channel of communication, which means making themselves more similar to or the same as their dogs, but also maintaining a hierarchy. And he connects that to all kinds of historical issues in the Amazon region, having to do with the colonial state and the way that indigenous people have been treated as less than over time, right? So, in other words, the unequal relationships, those sort of power-laden hierarchies among humans also inform the way that Runa think about and interact with their dogs. So they open these channels of communication, again, through this use of certain substances and interpreting dreams, etc. But the danger is that if you become the same in order to converse, that then you will blur those categories too much. So they use a very particular sort of grammar, right? And you read some examples in the article about what that sort of speech sounds like. And the idea is that that is necessary to open that line of communication without really putting the Runa in danger, right, of overlapping too much with what it means to be a dog. So I think where Cohn sort of ends in this analysis is that kind of communication across species lines is both necessary, but almost as a matter of course, it's going to be partial. You can't have total communication. It's also dangerous, right, because it threatens to sort of challenge the boundaries between different categories like that, the different species categories. And it's political, right? It sort of calls into question the unequal positions of the two parties involved in the conversation. And that harkens back to colonial history and lots of other experiences that Runa people have had. So it's both about sort of communicating in the here and now, but it also has sort of echoes of long-term experiences of interpersonal hierarchies, and the sort of unequal power that lie in those. Okay, so that's Kohn. Again, sort of a complex, but I think fascinating case study, and one that goes to the heart of, I think, the question of this course, which is, dogs and humans in many cultural contexts are closely related, right? We interact in very intimate ways. How do we think about both our sameness and our difference? So the second case study is totally different part of the world. This is Lemon writing about dogs in the Moscow subway. And she has this is a quote from the article that I think really sums up what she's up to here, which is trying to understand how humans and non-humans reciprocally know and make each other. So again, her case study is about dogs in Moscow, particularly a subset of dogs, the dogs that ride the subway. So sort of a fascinating example of dog-human interactions. And what she describes here is that the people in Moscow who sort of obviously on a day-to-day basis see these dogs, right, in the stations, on the trains, asking for food, sleeping on the seats, etc., have all kinds of thoughts about them. Generally, they seem to be well regarded, right? People find it amusing, and also they seem to feel like those dogs in a certain way sort of encapsulate an ideal that is now sort of historically gone, right? Or is under threat, which is some of the ideas that were sort of the ideals of the Soviet state, about universal care for everyone in the entire country, about attending to other people and their well-being. So there's something about these sort of public dogs that calls up those questions for people. There's a sort of nostalgia for that Soviet sort of commitment to an ideal of at least an ideal, if not a practice always, of care, right? Something that's been certainly threatened by the neoliberal era, and the sort of every person for him or herself sort of attitude of that particular political economic ideology. And the fact that all of this is going down in the subway system also is significant. One of the themes in Lemon's article is really about how sort of the urban landscape, right, the built urban landscape, is important for fashioning people's thoughts on things, right? And as she mentions, the metro in Moscow has that effect on people, right? It sort of links the modern era, the 21st century, to the Soviet world and some of the sort of major works that were meant to instill in people an understanding of the Soviet Union as a modern state. So the fact that there are these dogs who are sort of the subway, but not really, and who navigate it really well, but are sort of breaking the rules that people have to follow, that is part of the reason it sort of becomes a place for conversation and debate among the people who are interacting with these street dogs. So, as Lemon describes it, it's not like people, all the sort of folks in Moscow who interact with these dogs have the same opinion, right? It's actually sort of a point of debate, right? She mentions that in 2002, a new policy was enacted that provided caretakers for sort of the street dogs of Moscow, right? Which was part of, again, that ethos of care, of sort of public care. And yet, in contrast to that, this last 20 years is also an era of rising nationalism and increasing marginalization of quote-unquote others, right? Meaning people who are immigrants or who are understood as non-Russian, whether they are really or not, right? So in other words, there's sort of some ambivalence there. The metro, the subway system, is sort of a symbol of a bygone era. And it's also a sign of modernity or an attempt to be a modern state. And the fact that there are these dogs in there, again, not following the rules, sort of, sleeping on the benches, etc., as you read, makes them interesting to people, and also makes them a phenomenon that allows for people to reflect on some of those issues of the state and the history of the Soviet state. So I think what Lemon's really getting at here is sort of talking about how the interactions between people and dogs, and also the landscape, right? All of this is sort of taking place in these underground tunnels and subway cars. How that all then encourages people to reflect on political history and the role of the state over time and the ideals of the state, right? Whether they're ideals to care for all or whatever else it may be. So it's sort of one part political history, one part the built landscape, and one part relationships between human and dogs. So again, a quite different example from Kohn, but certainly one that I think speaks to the course's themes really well. So another really interesting example. Okay, so the final case that you read is one set here in the U.S., and this is Brandes talking about, in fact, not the relationships between people and their living pets, but how people memorialize their pets in pet cemeteries. I have to admit that I was not really familiar with the phenomenon of pet cemeteries before I read this piece. And I was, because I found from the article that actually there are lots of these pet cemeteries around, I looked for any that were sort of close to where we are now, and I found several. One of the biggest ones is the Hinsdale Pet Cemetery in Willowbrook, so maybe an hour from Chicago, which has been there for going on 100 years. Here's one of the headstones, and from what I could see online, it really exactly exemplifies what Brandes is talking about, right? So Brandes looks at pet cemeteries, and particularly the inscriptions that people put on the headstones for their pets over the course of a century. And there's some things that are sort of general points that Brandes makes, and some things that are particular, and they're about how those pet cemeteries have changed over time, right? So the thing that's in common across all of this is that the very existence of pet cemeteries indicates that animals and the animals that we keep as pets have a certain status, right? That this sort of roughly 100-year history of having specialized cemeteries with headstones and all the rest indicates the role that pets have as effectively family members, right? Over these last 100 years. So even just the fact of the cemeteries is important, right? It demonstrates a sort of a shift in the role of animals in people's lives. There's been more recent shifts as well. So Brandes, again, is looking over about 100 years and notes a shift after World War II. So starting in sort of, the late 40s, let's say. And those shifts take three forms. One is the form of the names that people give to their pets, again, as memorialized on these headstones. So one of the things that Brandes notes is that the names, in the 1920s, say, were the names of animals were not the same as the names of humans, right? Like there was a special category of, say, dog names, and they were not the names you'd give to your child. So it was sort of a sign of a clear distinction between the dog in your family versus the humans in your family. After World War II, what he finds is an increasing sort of anthropomorphizing of the pets, both in terms of their names. So increasingly you have pets with what are also the names that we give to humans, but also you find more personal details about the breed of dog or the sex of the dog or whatever inscribed on the headstone, right? So not just a dog lies here, but something that really sort of demonstrates the degree to which people were thinking of that dog as human-like or as certainly a member of the family. The second shift that Brandes notes is in the degree to which people call out the pet as a family member. using terms that indicate that animal was considered to be a member of the family or a kin, such as baby, right? Or he mentions, headstones where the humans who buried the pet refer to themselves as the pet's mother or father, right? So getting more sort of explicit about the degree to which the pet is considered to be a member of the family, and the terms used to indicate kin are being used now in relationship to the pet. And then the final shift that Brandes finds, again, this sort of post-World War II era, is increasing reference to other kinds of social affiliations in the way that the pet's headstone is inscribed. So things like religious references. Some of the common phrases that he found were things like, again, on the dog's headstone, see you in heaven, right? So in other words, almost incorporating the pet into the worldview, the religion, the ethnicity of the humans, and understanding them, therefore, to be sort of part of the same world, right? So again, this is a totally different part of the world, sort of a very different kind of study than the other two, but grappling with some of those same issues, which is there's something about humans relating to, particularly the pets that they keep in their homes or keep near their homes. It raises that question about in what ways are we different, in what ways are we the same. So this particular piece is really about a shift from a greater sense of difference between animals and humans in the past to a greater sense of sameness between animals and their pets as you get more historically close, right? Again, through the lens of headstone inscriptions. Okay, well, we've covered a lot of material in a short amount of time, so I'm going to leave it there. But again, I hope that as you've read these, you've gotten a sense not only of some of these big themes around the relationships between dogs and humans, but also how cultural anthropologists do their work and the kinds of analyses that are really a part of the field. All of these examples, I think, are really good for understanding what cultural anthropologists do and understanding really what's at stake in the kind of field work and the kind of questions that cultural anthropologists ask. So I hope you enjoyed them, and we will talk again soon. Bye.